Repair it, restore it, or scrap it? Welcome to Lancaster Hi-Fi. Should you get your vintage audio gear repaired when it malfunctions? Even if it's working okay, maybe it's not sounding as good as it should. Maybe your amp or receiver produces a hum or a crackle that you don't remember from back in the day. Hell, maybe it's humming in harmony with an audible hiss while a popping sound keeps a beat and you use the volume control to scratch over the track. Plus, the formerly brightly lit silver face is now unlit and grimy. Your gear needs an overhaul. It needs restoration. But should you pay for that restoration? If the cost is daunting, could you do some of the work yourself? I'm in a group called Repair, Restore, or Scrap It Audio and Video on Facebook, so I know these are questions that a lot of people have. I've repaired and restored enough gear to have struggled with this issue. Since I do the repairs and restorations myself, and the cost of components is typically small, especially for a solid-state amp or receiver, I don't struggle with these questions for my own gear. Rather, I struggle with the pressure to keep the cost of repair reasonable for others whose gear I work on. Some cases are obvious. If you've got a Macintosh or Audio Research or comparable high-end amp or preamp that you bought back in the day for several thousand, maybe more than $10,000, pounds, or euros in today's money, you're probably willing to spend a few $100s for a repair or $1,000 or $2,000 for a restoration when the time comes. If you've got some secondhand BPC, black plastic crap, receiver that you bought for $20 a few years ago, you've already gotten your money's worth and that BPC is headed for the landfill or local thrift store. The questions of repair and restoration become difficult for beautiful vintage gear that was bottom to middle of the line when it was new. Say you've got a Sansui 2000A like I do. Maybe you bought it new back in the day, or maybe you got it for $5 at a yard sale like I did. You were enjoying it, but now it's got some lights out and one channel keeps going out. When both channels play, there's a hum that seems to be getting louder. You look on eBay and find that restored, updated, pristine-looking units have recently sold for under $400, including shipping. Maybe you start doing the math in your head. What's a reasonable hourly rate for a qualified tech? $30? $50? More? Maybe you even remove the wooden case, look inside, and imagine how much time it would take to replace a single resistor in an awkward spot. Maybe you went pale at the thought several years ago, put the receiver on a shelf in the basement, and bought a second-hand BPC receiver off Craigslist. It's fine, you suppose, but sometimes you look at that old Sansui gathering dust on the shelf and you miss the enjoyment you got from using that old receiver. I think you should invest in that old receiver, especially if it holds sentimental value. If you have no emotional attachment to a unit that's not worth much anyway, then maybe you should just sell it as a non-working unit. In this video, I'll be talking to those of you that want to see your vintage gear returned to its former glory. Even if your gear is worth spending a lot of money on, doing the non-technical, often time-consuming work yourself will save you some money and earn you favor with your repair tech. I'll cover some common problems with vintage gear and how to solve them. Almost anyone can do a lot of the work themselves. I'll try to progress from easy to hard, from cosmetics to electronics. I'll focus on the work that almost anyone can do, work that will save you a lot of money, even if you still end up needing a tech to work on the electronics. Does that old silver face fail to shine? Well, clean the damn thing. Is the wooden case a mess? Restore that finish. Do some or all of the lights fail to shine? You can probably replace those too. While you're at it, you'll want to clean the interior of amps, receivers, CD players, and tape decks. A service manual may come in handy. Google the make and model with service manual. Look for the link to Hi-Fi Engine or Vinyl Engine. Follow the link and make a free account. Download the service manual. Have it open on your laptop, tablet, or phone. You don't need a tech to clean your gear, but be careful. For thorough cleaning of an amp or receiver, you should remove the knobs and faceplate. For a turntable, remove the dust cover, head shell, mat, and platter. Most platters pull straight off, but some are more complicated, so consult the manual. Take some high-res photos before disassembly and during the process. Prepare a bowl, cup, tray, or some other dish to receive the parts as you remove them. Don't skip the dish, or you'll be sorry. I have a heavy magnetized dish. Anything will do, but the magnetized dish lets me place the hardware together in groups where it will stay. The top cover of my iFixit driver set has divisions that accomplish the same purpose. You may want to take pictures of hardware as you remove it so you'll know what to put back where. Most knobs will pull straight off. A few will have set screws requiring an Allen wrench or, in rare cases, a small screwdriver. Figure it out. Loosen the set screws and remove the knob. The handles on toggle switches pull straight off. I'll warn you that most knobs and switch handles have metal shells glued to plastic inserts, and the glue may fail when you pull off the knob or switch handle. Don't worry. If the knob has a position indicator, mark its position on the plastic insert. You can glue them back together later with plain old white glue, but I prefer Aleene's tacky glue. Push button covers may pull off, but usually the faceplate needs to come off first. Those sometimes have springs, so don't lose them. With the knobs and switch handles off, you'll see that some, maybe all, of the knob spindles have nuts and washers securing the faceplate. Take some more high-res photos. I use a crescent wrench or spanner to loosen the nuts. Be extra careful to make sure the tool doesn't touch the faceplate. I usually use the tool for a quarter turn or less and do the rest with my fingers. When I put them back on, I may only finger tighten them if the unit doesn't need to travel. Once you've got those nuts and washers off, the faceplate may come free. If it doesn't, then it's also secured with screws on the top and or bottom. To access the screws on the top, you'll need to remove the cover. The screws on the bottom are usually accessible without removing the bottom cover. Top covers are usually secured with 4 bolts, 2 on each side. Remove those. If the cover doesn't come off easily, look for 1 to 3 screws securing the cover to the back panel, and remove those. Yamaha receivers with wooden cases are held in with 4 bolts on the bottom. In general, if your unit has a wooden case, there may also be bolts or screws on the bottom. Remember, everything goes into the dish. If your dish isn't big enough for all those knobs and switch handles, put those in a separate cup or bag. With the case or cover removed, and maybe the bottom cover, you'll be able to find and remove any screws holding on the faceplate. Pull it off, but only a little bit at first. Look into the gap to see whether any wires connect the faceplate to the rest of the unit. An integrated amp may have a little red light indicating the power is on. Often you can simply unplug the wires. If you can't, see how much slack you have and deal with it. And you may want to reattach the faceplate and clean it in place. If the faceplate is easily removable, set the rest of the pieces aside while you work on it. I generally keep a towel on my bench to protect both the bench top and the piece I'm working on. Sometimes I clean faceplates, knobs, and switch covers in the sink. If there's no wood or foam to worry about, you can probably put the pieces in soapy water. If the faceplate has wooden end pieces, like on the Pioneer SX, X2X, and X3X series, those are held on with wood screws and should probably be removed. Even if some pieces are glued, it's probably fine as long as you don't leave the assembly soaking for hours, and probably even if you do. These days, I mainly use countertop cleaner and paper towels and do the cleaning on the bench. Some people swear by Simple Green, and some use wet wipes. Any simple, water-based detergent will do, but you should probably stay away from cleaners meant for removing adhesive and other residue, like Goo Gone. Don't use scrub brushes. You want to clean without removing any of the lettering. Some stains, like tobacco smoke, will require persistence. You may want to use a toothbrush on knobs if they're knurled or otherwise grooved, but avoid any markings when using the brush. I often find there are light white stains that detergent won't remove from aluminum. Bit of stuff there and there. Don't worry about it, because the next step will deal with that. After cleaning with detergent, I generally use Mother's mag and aluminum polish. That's what others have recommended to me, but you may prefer something else. At this point, I need to make a disclaimer because we're probably going to use the polish off-label. Anodized aluminum doesn't polish in the sense of removing oxidation, so the label will tell you not to use polish on such surfaces. I do it anyway. Not always, but usually, because the polish contains ingredients for cleaning and buffing. With enough buffing, the polish will usually take care of those light white stains on aluminum, whether the surface is anodized or not. With cleaning and polishing done, this is a good time to re-glue any knobs or switch covers that came apart. For knobs, you can usually figure out the correct orientation from the remnants of the old glue if you didn't mark the pieces when they came apart. Now, turn your attention to the case or cover and any wooden pieces. The wood is often pretty tired after all these years. I use Howard's Restore finish on the wood to even out the finish. I typically use quadruple-aught steel wool for that. Sometimes the Restore finish is enough, but sometimes I want to put a shinier finish on the wood. Many people will tell you to use Howard's Feed-In Wax next, and that may be fine, but conservators advise against it. Apparently, too much of the feed-in wax can cause the wood veneer to separate. Conservators recommend Brywax, which is a carnauba and beeswax blend made slushy with a nasty solvent like xylene or toluene. Use this stuff in an open garage or outdoors, or at least open the windows and close the door to the rest of the house. Brywax should be applied liberally and rewards elbow grease by buffing to a high shine. Brywax is a commitment, and it's okay if you don't want to use it. Like I said, the Restore finish is often adequate. If you do use Brywax, follow the instructions on the Restore finish label and wait 24 hours before applying the Brywax. If the case is wood but has vinyl veneer, well, you can take the easy way or the hard way. If that vinyl is relatively unscarred, the countertop cleaner will probably do fine. If the vinyl looks dull after cleaning and drying, you might shine it up with a little mineral oil on a cloth. Try it first on a small area that won't be too noticeable. They always say that, right? But if the bottom isn't an option, then I figure I'm committed once I start. So start with just a little dab and spread it around. Then use a little more if things are moving in the right direction. But what if the vinyl is sticky? Well, that might happen when ultraviolet light breaks some of the crosslinks in the polymers, blah, blah, blah. I've had this problem once on some speakers, and I had good results with isopropyl alcohol to remove the sticky and mineral oil to restore the shine. Your mileage may vary. I would probably advise against a stronger solvent like acetone, which might dissolve more than the sticky part. What if the vinyl is horribly scarred and or peeling? If there's a small bit that's become wrinkled or peeled, you may be able to fix the problem with a heat gun or hairdryer. Get the area hot and manipulate the vinyl back into its proper place with tweezers. If the problem is more severe, well, consider it an opportunity, because the only way to fix the problem is to take off the old wrap and apply new veneer. You can look at the problem as an opportunity to make your vintage gear even more beautiful than when it was new. I've replaced the vinyl veneer on a couple of pieces, a Realistic Lab 400 and a Pioneer SX 780 with cherrywood veneer, and the results were quite nice. It's a fiddly process that takes substantial time to do right, so consider your options carefully. If the cover or case is metal or has metal parts, then clean the metal with the countertop cleaner and assess. How is the paint job? Any rust? Is a new paint job warranted? Consider carefully. If we're talking about a metal screen or other insert on a wooden case, the metal probably has some loose paint and or rust that should be scraped off, and then you should repaint the metal. It's usually black, so matching the color is easy, but you may have to do some thinking to match the gloss. I generally use either high gloss applied with a brush or matte finish applied with a spray can. If the case is all metal and has a few dings and scratches but no rust, then I suggest stopping after cleaning. However, if you have to remove a significant amount of rust and flaking paint, bite the bullet and repaint. What if it's a powder coat? Then it's not flaking off and there isn't much rust. That's the point of a powder coat. I haven't repainted many metal cases, but here's one I did repaint. It was a tricky paint job because it's black and gold, and the two colors meet at an arbitrary point on an otherwise featureless surface. Doing this job well took several rounds of masking one side and then the other with paper and painter's tape. It's still not perfect, but the one or two imperfections aren't noticeable. While the case and faceplate are off, you can address the interior. It's probably dusty and you'll want to clean out the dust. Most people would probably recommend taking the unit outside and blasting it with compressed gas. Maybe I'm lazy, but carrying a heavy piece of vintage gear up the stairs and outside and negotiating 3 closed doors along the way is a hassle. Plus I live in Western Oregon where it rains half the time, so I generally keep a few old paintbrushes, one big and a couple small, on my bench and use those to clean off the loose dust and debris. I can then use the countertop cleaner and towels to clean off various interior surfaces. If you're restoring a vintage receiver, then the surface behind the glass is particularly important to get clean. Often, dusting with brushes is sufficient. Some messes require stronger stuff applied to small spaces, and I keep a small bottle of 99% isopropanol and foam swabs on my bench for cleaning limited areas with a solvent. I recommend the foam swabs because cotton swabs snag on sharp bits and leave behind fibers that, in the best case, are unsightly and, in the worst case, can cause electrical shorts. If your unit has lamps that aren't lighting, now is the time to address those. First, make sure you know which lights work and which don't. With the cover off, plug the unit in, turn it on, and cycle through the functions. Lights on receivers can be tricky. For example, on the Sansui 2000A, the dial only lights up when one of the tuner functions is selected, and the stereo light should only come on when a station comes in strongly enough to enable stereo multiplexing. Signal strength and tuning center meters may not light when the tuner isn't engaged. Some lights are easy to replace, and others are a royal pain. Dial lights on receivers are usually relatively easy to replace. I generally replace old incandescent lamps with LEDs, and if one dial light is out, I typically replace all of them. LED replacements for fuse-style lamps come in packages of, say, 10, and gaining access to any of these lamps grants access to all of them. Some people will caution that the AC power sources for the lights aren't appropriate for LEDs, but I've never had any problem using LEDs. They can behave strangely with video, where they may appear lit intermittently. On late 70s receivers, wedge-type bulbs were more common, and those are pretty easy to replace, provided you can find the right replacement lamps. With the fuse-style lamps, access can be tricky, so consult the service manual. In some cases, you can unscrew the dial face to get to the lamps. In other cases, you have to remove the housing from behind the face, and that can get fiddly. If you search for LED replacement bulbs on Amazon, you'll find many for automotive use, and these are designed for a 12-volt DC supply. Can you use these in vintage receivers? Yes, but lamps in vintage receivers generally have 8-volt AC power supplies. These might be okay. 8 volts RMS is plus and minus 12 volts peak to peak. Still, some 12-volt LEDs may appear dimmer than you'd like with 8-volt supplies. I did find an eBay seller who makes wedge lamps designed for 8-volt supplies. Some people say you shouldn't replace incandescent lamps with LEDs. They're not the right color. They flicker. They're not like the originals. I say if you don't like the color of the bright white LEDs, use warm white ones. If you notice the flickering, well, wow, you're a mutant. And it's true that they're not like the originals. LEDs don't produce enough heat to cook plastic housings and shrink vinyl veneers. Do I always replace incandescent lamps with LEDs? No, because I've replaced enough lamps to have a stock of salvaged incandescents. And if I'm doing a repair or quick refurb for resale by a client, then it may be quicker and cheaper to replace 1 or 2 bad lamps from my stock of salvaged lamps. What about the little wheat lamps typically used for function lights? These are a pain to replace because they're not plug and play. The lamps are integral to the wiring. For these, I keep these LEDs with current limiting resistors and leads already attached. I snip the old wires, pull the old lamps and wires from and through the housings, insert the wires for the LEDs, and work the new lamps into the old housings. Finally, I splice the old and new wires together. However, you should consult a schematic before replacing these lights to make sure the supply isn't DC. If the lights have a DC supply, you'll need to determine the polarity of the supply and the LEDs and make sure you put them in the right way around. Pretty sweet looking. And notice how all of a sudden I've moved from cosmetic work that almost anyone can do to electrical work that requires reading schematics and soldering wires? Before I dive into electrical work, I'll back up to address some common mechanical issues with often simple fixes. Perhaps surprisingly, I'll start with tape decks, and I'll draw on the example of a quick refurb for resale of a cassette deck I did last year. I had agreed to do the work on the condition that no belts or tires needed replacement. For a cassette deck, belt and tire replacement, in the best case, almost always requires disassembly of the compactified mechanism, and almost every model is different. In the worst case, the old belts and tires have turned to tar that you'll need to remove. It's a messy job that can take hours. Now, if you have a deck you are determined to restore, but the belts and tires have turned to tar, you definitely can and should do the cleanup yourself. As a tech, my time is wasted on such loathsome work, and because I hate that kind of work, I will not only charge you for every minute of the time required, I may even charge you a higher hourly rate. So buckle up. You'll need lots of solvent, many swabs, and ample patience. Can you use acetone, which will be more effective than isopropanol? I don't know. If you want to use acetone, make sure it won't dissolve the plastic you're trying to clean. If you have a tape deck, whether reel-to-reel, cassette, or 8-track, you should regularly clean the heads, rollers, and capstans with isopropanol. How often? Some say you should clean these things after every use. If you take a tape deck in from the wild, you shouldn't expect that it's been properly maintained. With my quick refurb job deck, the playhead, capstan, and roller were all coated with oxide residue. The coating on the playhead was thick and hard enough to closely resemble the caramelized layer on creme brulee. In retrospect, I should have taken it back to the client for him to clean, but the coating was so hard that I doubted myself. Maybe the head was meant to be that way. It took me hours to clean off all of that oxide buildup. I searched online in vain for a method more effective than swabs and isopropanol. If you're restoring a tape deck, cleaning the heads, rollers, and capstans does not require technical skills, and you can and should do the cleaning yourself. After that deck was sold, it developed another problem that I felt obliged to fix. It made an awful mechanical screeching sound. I fixed this problem by removing the cover, putting some 3-in-1 oil in a syringe, and applying the oil to the main motor spindle. I also tried applying oil to the capstan bearing, but that bearing wasn't the source of the screeching. I'll move along to CD players. In my experience, the most common malfunction is a drawer that doesn't open reliably. Typically, the problem is a belt that has lost its elasticity. Of course, the best fix is to replace the belt. But finding the right replacement belt can be a daunting task, and there's an easy fix that will probably last at least a few years. Boil the belt! Yes, you heard me right. I can't remember whether I read about this online or got it from an incident from my childhood. A high school friend of my older brother used to work on my dad's gear. I'm still in touch with this friend. Clark is an awesome guy. Anyway, my dad had a turntable with a make so obscure that it wasn't branded on the exterior. I forget the exact problem it had. Give me a break. I was probably 9 or 10 at the time. Long story short, Clark was able to fix the problem by boiling a rubber bushing. I recall him exclaiming, "Boil the bushings!" Well, if the drawer on your CD player doesn't open, boil the belt. It's typically pretty easy to remove and replace once you remove the top cover. And that belt is typically the only one that's easily accessible, but you might want to consult a service manual. Take off the belt, soak it in boiling hot water, replace the belt. Problem solved, at least for a while. Are there easy fixes for common turntable problems? Certainly. I'll start with the easiest and most common. I replaced the stylus a while back, and it was sounding great, but it's been getting worse, and now it sounds like crap. Clean the stylus! A friend of mine had this problem. He had even bought and used the Audio-Technica cleaning solution I recommended. I came over with my own bottle and a hand lens, because what self-respecting geologist doesn't have a hand lens? He played a record for me. Indeed, it sounded like crap. While he was putting that record away, I secured the tone arm, removed the head shell, and inspected the stylus under magnification. As I had suspected, the stylus was covered with crud. I pulled out my cleaner and carefully cleaned off the crud. Problem solved. You might be saying to yourself, what a bonehead. But I would urge you to check your disdain. He had followed the instructions on the bottle, and they had said to simply give the stylus a few swipes in the direction of platter rotation. Moreover, the stylus looked fine to the naked eye. Do you carry around a hand lens? Look, stylus wear is real, but the more common problems are the buildup of dirt and vinyl residue, and a thorough cleaning of the stylus with the appropriate solution can add years to the functional life of your stylus. As I've said before on this channel, before my friend Chris gave me a Riga Affida moving coil cartridge, I had been using the stylus I bought in the 80s. Okay, yes, I had gone 10 or 20 years without using it, so maybe I only got 10 years out of that stylus. It is still usable, but the Affida is better. A word of caution is warranted. Be careful to limit the application of cleaning solution to the immediate vicinity of the stylus. You don't want that stuff climbing up the cantilever and into the inner workings of the cartridge. All of a sudden, my belt drive turntable won't turn. Replace the belt. Determine and order the proper replacement with the help of the internet and consult the manual for the proper method of replacement. However, I will caution you that you should shop around for the best belt. While it can be hard to overcome the urge to buy the cheapest available belt, the cheapest belt may be garbage. A belt drive turntable needs a belt with not only the right thickness, but also regular thickness. A belt that's too thick will cause the platter to spin too quickly, and a belt that's irregular will cause platter speed variations. In the past, I would have recommended belts from LP Gear, but more recently I ordered 3 belts from LP Gear, and all 3 were both too thick and too irregular. I was slow to realize that the belts were the sources of the problems with these turntables. I talked before about using cleaner and polish, and my advice is also appropriate for turntables. Just be careful, especially with the tone arm and gimbal and whatnot. And what about the dust cover? I recommend polishing the dust cover with Plastex, which is sold as a polish for headlights with plastic lenses. Polishing won't remove scratches and gouges, of course, but the dust cover will look better. What about cracks? If you can't live with a crack, I recommend you buy a new dust cover from J&B Audio on eBay. If they don't have a cover for your particular model, they will make one for you if you supply them with adequate measurements of the original cover. I supplied them with a labeled drawing for the cover of a realistic Lab 400, and the replacement they provided was excellent. It may be possible to mend cracks, but I haven't had good enough success with mending to recommend it. I'll move along now to electrical issues. The most common issues are also the easiest to fix. Every time you adjust the volume, balance, or tone controls, you get loud, awful, static, crackle, and pop sounds from the speakers, or one channel goes out completely. Treat the pots. By pots, I mean potentiometers, and potentiometers are the things you're using when you manipulate the volume, balance, and tone controls. So what's the treatment? The treatment for pots is Deoxit Fader F5. The process is to spray a small amount of F5 into the pot, work the control back and forth many times, and finish with one more small squirt. That process, of course, relies on you being able to direct the end of the spray tube to the pot interior. In some cases, removal of the top and or bottom covers will provide sufficient access to the pots, but in other cases, not so much. The last time I treated the volume pot on my son's Pioneer SX828, the process took hours and necessitated a ridiculous amount of disassembly. With that caveat, with the cover off and the restore finish or paint drying, now is the time to treat the pots if you want to attempt it. A word of caution. Do not spray the controls spindle from the front and think you're doing anything good. At best, there will be no effect. At worst, you'll remove something beneficial and or promote the buildup of dust and debris that will gum up the controls. If your amp or receiver has front panel switches, those can also cause problems that aren't easily diagnosed. With the cover and faceplate removed, treatment of those switches may be possible and, if so, should be done. For switches, you'll need a different product, Deoxit D5. For push-button switches, arrange a cushion, like a folded towel, for the protruding bits on the back panel and rest the unit on that back panel so that the pot, spindles, and push-button switches all point straight up, that is, vertically. Stick the end of the spray tube up to the plastic stems behind the push buttons and spray a small amount of D5 on each side of each push-button stem. Wait a minute or two for the liquid to flow down the stem and into the switch innards, and then work each switch many times, like 20 or 30. As with the pots, give each switch a couple of finishing squirts. For toggle switches, stem squirts probably won't work. I mean, it might, but the stems don't lead directly to the electrical contacts like in push-button switches. However, toggle switches usually do have some gaps in their housings, and you can usually get the end of your spray tube to a spot where you can get some D5 into the switch innards. Find a spot and spray on both sides of each switch. As before, work each switch 20 or 30 times and give the switches those finishing squirts. Hey, with all this squirting, won't all that liquid make a mess? Quite possibly, yes, and those paper towels and swabs you marshaled for cleaning purposes are your friends for mopping up drips of excess F5 and D5. Also, try not to get any of either on your clothes. Some of you might be complaining that all of the stuff I've covered so far sounds like a lot of work. Fine, get someone like me to do the work for you. But don't complain when you get a bill for 10 hours of labor before I've even warmed up my soldering iron. Just saying. If you do all of the things I've recommended so far, you'll have made your vintage piece of gear beautiful again, and you've likely solved those issues of crackling and static and intermittent channels. The drawer on your CD player works like it should. Your tapes and records sound amazing now. However, all of these things may be insufficient. You've still got a hum. One channel is just out, or there's no sound at all, maybe from just the phono input, but maybe from any input. CDs skip, or the error indicator lights up on the player. The speed of the turntable occasionally, maybe frequently, goes all wonky. Tapes still sound off. I'll start with the last first. Take off the tape compartment door. Consult the service manual first so you don't break anything. Put in a tape, press play, and look at where the playhead comes up against the tape. Do you see a little screw? And can you get at it with a little screwdriver? Awesome. Play the tape through your speakers or headphones. I like headphones for this because usually I can plug them directly into the player without hooking up an amp and speakers. Turn the little screw one way and then the other, and note the change in sound. Does turning it in one direction improve the sound? Awesome. Keep turning the screw in that direction until you notice the sound getting worse again, and then turn the screw back in the direction of better sound. When you think you've found the sweet spot, you're done. What if your player has more than one little screw? I don't know. That's the situation I'm in with my Nakamichi. I might need to find someone better equipped for tape deck repair. So your turntable speed goes all wonky sometimes? If your table has speed adjustment knobs, those might be connected to pots that need treatment. As with amps and receivers, some disassembly and fader F5 are required. Consult the service manual. If your turntable has micro switches in the power path, cleaning the contacts might solve the problem. Some disassembly and deoxit D5 are required. Consult the service manual and consider carefully. This is a fiddly job, and you'll need to be careful and patient to disassemble the micro switches without breaking them or losing parts and get the D5 where it belongs. Definitely fiddly. The CD player is still malfunctioning? You could try cleaning the lens, maybe cleaning off old lube and reapplying fresh. Fiddly work that's hit or miss. If your amp or receiver has a hum, does the hum get louder or softer when you turn the volume up or down? Probably not. You probably need to replace the main filter capacitors in the power supply, and this is something that should probably be done anyway after 50 years. Are you handy with a soldering iron? Do you know how to choose replacement components? If either answer is no, then you should probably find a tech. No sound? See if you can isolate the problem to one input. Take notes. If the phono inputs don't work, but the other inputs do, then there's a problem with the phono preamp. If it's a both channels problem, it's probably the power supply. Does your amp or receiver have pre-out main-in jacks on the back? And do you have a spare amp or receiver that also has those jacks? If yes, then connect the pre-outs from the problem unit to the main ins of the spare. Good sound from both channels? Then the problem is with the power amp section. No sound? Then it's the preamp. Both channels? Probably the power supply. Next, connect the pre-outs from the spare to the main ends of the problem unit. Good sound from both channels? Preamp problem. No sound? It's the power amp. Both channels out? Probably the power supply. No sound from either channel in either connection configuration? Probably the power supply. Take careful notes and pass them along to the tech. The information may save him some time in finding the problem. Magic smoke? Look, quickly, to see if you can localize the source of the smoke and then turn off the unit. Make a note of your observations and pass that information along to the tech. And I got a bit of smoke here, and then noticed smoke from here where we see the charring. Dang, that was a lot, but I hope you found some of it helpful. If you did, then surely I've earned your subscription. Do it! Thanks for watching, have a great day, and I'll talk to you later. Okay, there we go. Grills painted and reattached to the case. Case looking beautiful. The front nice and sparkly, shiny. And let's turn her on. Turn off the light. And there we go. A beautiful Pioneer SX850. So nice.